In the summer of 1886, when the prairie winds carried the scent of wild sage and the promise of thunderstorms, Willow Creek was the kind of settlement that existed on hope and stubbornness in equal measure. Nestled in a valley between rolling hills that stretched endlessly toward the horizon, it was a place where people came to start over, to build something from nothing, to carve out a life from the unforgiving but beautiful landscape of the American frontier. The town consisted of little more than a main street lined with weathered wooden buildings. Henderson's General Store, with its creaking porch and hand-painted sign. The Silver Dollar Saloon, where cowboys and ranchers gathered to share news and whiskey. Doc Warren's medical practice that doubled as the town's unofficial gathering place during emergencies, and the small white church where Reverend Matthews preached to a congregation that fluctuated with the seasons and the fortunes of the surrounding ranches. At the eastern edge of town stood Mrs. Abernathy's boarding house, a two-story structure with faded blue shutters and a wraparound porch that offered the best view of the sunrise over the prairie. It was here that Martha Sullivan had made her home for the past 2 years, occupying a small but comfortable room on the second floor that overlooked the vegetable garden where she helped Mrs. Abernathy grow tomatoes, beans, and squash. Martha had arrived in Willow Creek in the spring of 1884, 23 years old and 6 months pregnant, carrying little more than a carpet bag and a letter of introduction from her late husband's cousin in Missouri. Robert Sullivan had died in a mining accident just weeks after learning he was to become a father, leaving Martha with neither family nor means of support. The cousin's letter had mentioned that Willow Creek was a place where a woman could find respectable work and a chance to raise a child in clean air and wide open spaces. Mrs. Abernathy, a widow herself who understood the particular challenges facing women alone on the frontier, had taken Martha in without question. In exchange for room and board, Martha helped with the cooking, cleaning, and mending that kept the boarding house running. It was honest work that allowed her to maintain her dignity while preparing for motherhood in a community that, despite its rough edges, had embraced her as one of their own. Thomas Robert Sullivan had been born on a crisp October morning, his first cries mixing with the sound of migrating geese overhead. From the moment Dr. Warren placed him in her arms, Martha knew that her son was the reason she had survived Robert's death, the reason she had found the courage to travel west, the reason her heart continued to beat. Thomas was a healthy, curious baby who grew into a bright-eyed toddler with his father's dark hair and his mother's determined chin. The boy had an insatiable appetite for the world around him. By his first birthday, he was walking with the unsteady determination of someone eager to explore every corner of his small universe. He would spend hours in Mrs. Abernathy's garden, carefully examining beetles and butterflies, his small hands surprisingly gentle as he touched flower petals and leaves. When the boarding house cat had kittens, Thomas appointed himself their protector, sitting guard by their basket and alerting the adults if he thought they were in any distress. Martha marveled daily at her son's capacity for joy. Thomas found wonder in the simplest things. The way sunlight streamed through the lace curtains in their room, the sound of rain on the roof, the taste of fresh honey on warm biscuits. He had a laugh that could fill a room and chase away the darkest moods, a giggle that started in his belly and bubbled up like water from a spring. Even the most hardened cowboys who frequented Henderson's store would soften when Thomas toddled up to them, offering his crooked smile and unintelligible but enthusiastic commentary on whatever caught his attention. The people of Willow Creek had watched Thomas grow with the kind of collective pride that small communities develop for their children. Mary Collins knitted him warm mittens for the winter. Timothy Fletcher's father, the blacksmith, crafted him a small wooden horse that became his most treasured possession. Doc Warren never charged for the boys' checkups, claiming that Thomas's visits brightened his day more than any payment could. Even the stern-faced banker, Mr. Cornelius could be seen slipping Thomas penny candy when his mother wasn't looking. For Martha, life in Willow Creek had settled into a rhythm that felt as natural as breathing. Her days began before dawn with the preparation of breakfast for the boarding house guests, usually traveling salesmen, occasional cowboys between jobs, and the circuit preacher who made his rounds every few months. Thomas would sit in his high chair, babbling contentedly while she worked, occasionally throwing pieces of biscuit to the floor for the ever-hopeful dog that belonged to one of the regular boarders. After the morning meal and clean-up, Martha would take Thomas for walks around town, stopping to chat with neighbors, running errands at the general store, or simply sitting in the shade of the big oak tree in the town square, while Thomas played with whatever treasures he discovered in the grass. These were precious hours, filled with the kind of simple happiness that Martha had never imagined possible during those dark months after Robert's death. In the afternoons, when Thomas napped, Martha would work on her sewing. She had developed a reputation for fine needlework, and many of the local women brought her their mending or commissioned her to make special garments for weddings and celebrations. The extra income allowed her to put aside small amounts of money each month, savings that she hoped would eventually provide Thomas with opportunities for education, or perhaps even a chance to see more of the world beyond Willow Creek. Evenings belonged entirely to her son. After supper, they would sit on the boarding house porch, Martha reading to Thomas from the small collection of books she had managed to acquire, fairy tales, Bible stories, and picture books featuring animals and far-off places. Thomas's favorite was a worn copy of Mother Goose rhymes that had belonged to his father as a child. He would point to the illustrations with excitement, trying to repeat the words in his sweet, high voice that never failed to make Martha's heart swell with love and pride. As summer deepened into August, Martha had begun to make plans for Thomas's second birthday. She had been saving fabric scraps to make him a new shirt, and Mrs. Abernathy had promised to help her bake a special cake. They had discussed having a small party in the boarding house parlor, inviting the neighbors who had become like family to them both. Martha had even begun work on a special quilt for Thomas's bed, choosing colors that reminded her of the prairie sunsets he loved to watch from their bedroom window. But the August heat that year was different, more oppressive than usual. The air hung heavy and still, with none of the cooling breezes that typically provided relief in the evenings. The creek that gave the town its name ran lower than anyone could remember, and the dust seemed to settle into everything, despite the women's best efforts to keep their homes clean. Children became fretful in the heat, and even the hardiest adults moved more slowly, conserving their energy for essential tasks. It was during this time of unseasonable weather that sickness came to Willow Creek. It started with the Williamson family on the edge of town, a fever that seemed to strike without warning, leaving its victims weak and burning with heat that no amount of cool cloths could relieve. Dr. Warren worked tirelessly, but his medical knowledge, suited as it was to treating injuries and common ailments, seemed inadequate against this particular illness. Within days, the fever had spread to 3 more families. The town that had buzzed with activity now moved with cautious quiet, mothers keeping their children close, neighbors checking on each other with worried expressions. The church bell rang more frequently than usual, tolling for the lives that the fever claimed with heartbreaking swiftness. Martha watched the progression of the illness with growing anxiety, holding Thomas closer, praying to whatever power might be listening that her precious boy would be spared. She took extra precautions, boiling their water, keeping their room meticulously clean, limiting their interactions with others despite the isolation it created. For several days, it seemed her efforts might be successful. Then on a Tuesday morning in late August, Thomas woke with a temperature that sent ice through Martha's veins despite the oppressive heat. His normally bright eyes were glassy and unfocused, his usually rosy cheeks flushed with the telltale sign of the fever that had been stalking their community. What followed were 3 days that would forever divide Martha's life into before and after. 3 days of desperate hope and mounting fear. 3 days of cool cloths and whispered prayers. 3 days of watching her son's small body fight a battle that stronger people had already lost. Dr. Warren came as often as he could, his kind face growing more grave with each visit. Mrs. Abernathy hovered nearby, ready to help, but understanding that there was little anyone could do except wait and hope. The other boarders spoke in hushed tones, their usual evening conversations replaced by worried whispers and offers of assistance that Martha was too frightened to acknowledge. On the third night, as Martha held Thomas against her chest, feeling the terrible heat radiating from his small body, she made promises to God, to fate, to anyone who might be listening. She promised to be a better person, to help more people, to never complain about anything again, if only her son could be spared. She promised to love him enough for both parents, to give him all the opportunities she could manage, to protect him from every harm the world might offer. But promises, Martha would learn, have no power against fever. Sometimes love is not enough. Sometimes the world takes what it will, leaving behind only the terrible mathematics of loss. One moment, everything. The next moment, nothing but the weight of memory and the unbearable lightness of empty arms. As dawn broke on that Friday morning in September, Martha found herself alone with her grief in a room that had been filled with love just hours before. Thomas was gone, and with him every plan she had made, every dream she had nurtured, every reason she had found to keep moving forward since Robert's death. The woman who would sit silent and unreachable on the boarding house porch for 3 days was not the same woman who had walked the streets of Willow Creek with her chattering toddler. That woman, the one who had found joy in simple pleasures, who had seen possibility in each new day, who had believed that love could conquer any challenge, had died with her son in her arms. What remained was something else entirely. A creature made of grief and silence, sitting in the ruins of a life that had seemed so promising just days before. The dust of Willow Creek settlement hung heavy in the September air, carried by winds that seemed to whisper secrets no one wanted to hear. Martha Sullivan sat on the weathered porch of the town's only boarding house, her body as still as the wooden rocking chair beneath her. 3 days had passed since the fever took little Thomas. 3 days since she'd held his small body until it grew cold in her arms. The townspeople moved around her like water around a stone, their eyes avoiding the woman who had become a living monument to grief. Mrs. Henderson from the general store had tried bringing soup that first day, but Martha hadn't even acknowledged her presence. The soup had grown cold, then been quietly removed by someone else. "She ain't said a word since," whispered Mary Collins to her husband as they passed by. "Doc Warren says the shock's got her mind all twisted up." But Martha could hear everything. Every whispered conversation, every pitying glance, every careful footstep that avoided coming too close. She just couldn't find the strength to respond. Her arms still held the phantom weight of Thomas, still curved in the shape of his small body. The August heat had been relentless, and the fever had taken him so quickly, too quickly for her to process, too quickly for goodbye. The sun began its descent behind the rolling hills that surrounded Willow Creek, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that reminded Martha of the quilt she'd been sewing for Thomas's bed. She'd never finish it now. The thought should have brought tears, but they had dried up on the second day, leaving only this hollow ache that seemed to consume everything inside her. From the corner of her eye, she noticed a figure approaching, a tall man with a weathered face and gentle eyes that had seen their share of hardship. Jack Morrison, the rancher who lived on the outskirts of town, had lost his own wife and son to cholera 5 years prior. Martha knew his story, as everyone in Willow Creek did, but she'd never really looked at him before, not like this. Without a word, Jack settled into the chair beside her. He didn't offer condolences or try to fill the silence with empty words. He simply sat there, his presence solid and understanding, watching the same sunset that Martha stared at but couldn't truly see. Jack Morrison had learned that grief spoke its own language, one that didn't need words. As he sat beside Martha, he remembered those first terrible weeks after losing Elizabeth and their boy Samuel. He remembered the way food tasted like ash, how colors seemed to drain from the world, how even breathing felt like a betrayal of those who could no longer draw breath. The evening air carried the scent of sage and prairie grass, mixing with the faint smell of wood smoke from the settlement's chimneys. Jack had come to town for supplies, but had seen Martha sitting alone and felt something pull at his chest. Recognition, perhaps, or the kind of understanding that only came from walking the same dark path. "I used to talk to them," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Elizabeth and Samuel. Every morning when I'd wake up, I'd tell them about the weather, about the cattle, about anything that came to mind. Folks probably thought I'd lost my mind." Martha's fingers tightened slightly on the arms of her chair, but she didn't look at him. "Doc Warren told me it wasn't healthy," Jack continued, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the first stars were beginning to appear. "Said I needed to accept they were gone and move on, but I couldn't figure out how to do that. How do you just stop loving someone?" A small sound escaped Martha's throat, not quite a sob, not quite a sigh, but something that acknowledged she'd heard him. "The thing is," Jack said, reaching into his shirt pocket and pulling out a small, smooth stone, "I still carry this. Samuel found it down by the creek the day before he got sick, said it looked like a heart. He held it up to catch the last rays of sunlight. I thought about throwing it away 100 times, but I couldn't. It was the last thing he gave me." Martha's gaze shifted slightly, focusing on the stone in Jack's weathered hands. It was smooth and grey, worn by water and time, and it did indeed resemble a heart. For the first time in 3 days, she felt something other than the crushing weight of emptiness. "I'm not saying it gets easier," Jack said, closing his fingers around the stone. "I'm saying it gets different. The love doesn't go away. It just finds a new place to live." As night settled over Willow Creek, Jack remained beside Martha, both of them wrapped in the kind of silence that spoke volumes. When Mrs. Henderson brought a lantern and set it on the porch table, Jack nodded his thanks. Martha didn't move, but he noticed her breathing had changed. Deeper, more deliberate, as if she were finally allowing air to fill her lungs again. The third night brought a cold front that sent most of the townspeople indoors, but Martha remained on the porch, now wrapped in a blanket that Jack had quietly draped around her shoulders. He had returned each evening, not speaking unless moved to do so, simply providing the kind of presence that asked for nothing in return. Tonight, however, Martha surprised him by speaking. "I can't remember his laugh," she said, her voice hoarse from disuse. 3 days, and I can't remember the sound of my own son's laughter." Jack shifted in his chair, choosing his words carefully. "What do you remember?" For a long moment, Martha was quiet. Then, slowly, she began to speak. The way his hair curled at the back of his neck when he was sweating. How he would scrunch up his nose when he was thinking hard about something. The way he'd reach for me in the morning, even before he opened his eyes. Her voice cracked on the last words, and Jack saw tears beginning to form in her eyes for the first time since he'd been sitting with her. "He loved biscuits with honey," Martha continued, the words coming easier now. "And he was afraid of thunder but loved the rain. He would stand at the window and press his little hands against the glass, watching the drops race down." Jack nodded, understanding. "Samuel used to collect feathers, said he was going to make wings so he could fly up to the clouds and see what they were made of." Martha turned to look at Jack for the first time. Really look at him. His face was kind, but marked by lines that spoke of his own struggles, his own losses. How long before it stops hurting so much? "I don't think it ever stops," Jack said honestly. "But it changes. The sharp edges get worn smooth, like that stone Samuel found. The love remains, but it becomes something you can carry without it cutting you every time you move." A cool breeze swept across the porch, carrying with it the scent of coming rain. Martha pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders, and found herself taking deeper breaths as if the night air might carry some small comfort. "I need to go to his grave," she said suddenly. "I haven't been able to. I couldn't." "I'll take you," Jack offered quietly. "Whenever you're ready." Martha nodded, and for the first time since Thomas died, she felt something other than despair. It wasn't hope, not yet, but it was the possibility of hope, the first tentative step toward learning how to exist in a world without her son. The morning sun cast long shadows across the small cemetery on the hill overlooking Willow Creek. Martha stood at the edge of the freshly turned earth, her hands trembling as she held the small wooden cross that marked Thomas's grave. Jack stood a respectful distance behind her, close enough to offer support, but far enough to give her space to grieve. "I should have been able to save him," Martha whispered, the words carried away by the gentle breeze. "I should have known the fever was getting worse. I should have done something." Jack stepped closer, his voice gentle but firm. "Elizabeth and Samuel got sick on a Tuesday. By Thursday they were gone. I rode hard to get the doctor, but the storm had washed out the bridge. I keep thinking about those hours, about what I might have done different." Martha turned to face him, seeing the pain in his eyes that mirrored her own. "But you still blame yourself." "Every day," Jack admitted, "but I've learned that blame is just another kind of prison. Thomas got sick, Martha. That's not your fault. It's just the way things sometimes are in this hard world." Martha knelt beside the grave, her fingers tracing the letters carved into the wooden cross. "I don't know how to live without him. He was everything to me." "You don't have to figure it all out today," Jack said, settling down beside her in the grass. "You just have to breathe. Just for today, just for this moment." Martha closed her eyes and took a deep breath, feeling the autumn air fill her lungs. When she opened them again, she noticed small wildflowers growing nearby, the kind Thomas had loved to pick for her. "He always brought me flowers," she said, a small smile touching her lips for the first time in days. "Dandelions, mostly. He thought they were beautiful." Jack reached over and picked one of the yellow blooms, handing it to Martha. "They are beautiful. He had good taste." Martha accepted the flower, twirling it between her fingers. "Maybe I could plant some here. Real flowers, I mean. Make it beautiful for him." "I could help you with that," Jack offered. "I know a thing or two about coaxing life from the ground." As they sat together in the quiet cemetery, Martha felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of the tight knot of grief that had been choking her for days. The pain was still there, would always be there, but it no longer felt like it might kill her. "Jack," she said quietly, "thank you for sitting with me, for not trying to fix me or make me feel better, for just being there." Jack nodded, understanding passing between them. "Sometimes the best thing you can do for someone is just show up. My Elizabeth used to say that presence is a gift you give without wrapping paper." Martha smiled at that, a real smile that reached her eyes. "I think Thomas would have liked you. He had a way of seeing the good in people, even when they couldn't see it themselves." "Maybe that's something he gave you," Jack suggested, "a way of seeing." As they prepared to leave the cemetery, Martha placed the dandelion on Thomas's grave. It was a small gesture, but it felt like a beginning, not an ending, but a new chapter in a story that would always include her son, just in a different way. Walking back down the hill toward town, Martha felt the weight of Jack's presence beside her, steady and reassuring. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew she wouldn't have to face it alone. Sometimes that was enough. Sometimes that was everything. The wind picked up, carrying with it the promise of rain and the scent of new growth. Martha breathed deeply, letting the air fill her lungs completely for the first time since Thomas died. She was learning to breathe again, one breath at a time, one moment at a time, one day at a time. Behind them, the dandelion on Thomas's grave danced in the breeze, bright and resilient, beautiful in its simplicity, just as her son had always said. The spring of 1887 arrived early in Willow Creek, bringing with it a warmth that seemed to seep into the very bones of the settlement. Martha stood in the doorway of what had once been the boarding house's unused back room, now transformed into a small but thriving flower shop. Sunlight streamed through the clean windows, illuminating rows of seedlings she'd started from packets Jack had brought her from his trips to the larger towns. "Mrs. Sullivan!" called young Timothy Fletcher, the blacksmith's son, as he approached with dirt-stained hands and an eager expression. "Ma says to ask if you've got any of those yellow flowers ready. She wants to plant some by our front steps." Martha smiled, the expression coming naturally now, though it had taken months to feel genuine again. "Marigolds," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "Tell your mother I'll have some ready by Saturday. But Timothy," she added, kneeling to meet the boy's eyes, "you make sure she plants them where they'll get morning sun, you hear?" The 8-year-old nodded solemnly, then hesitated. "Mrs. Sullivan, Ma also wanted me to tell you that if you ever want to come to Sunday dinner, we'd be mighty pleased to have you." The invitation warmed Martha's heart in a way that surprised her. 6 months ago, she wouldn't have been able to imagine accepting such kindness. Now, she found herself considering it seriously. "You tell your mother that's very kind, and I'll think on it." After Timothy scampered off, Martha returned to her work, carefully transplanting delicate seedlings into larger pots. The rhythmic work had become a form of meditation for her, a way to focus her mind on growth and possibility rather than loss and regret. Each plant represented a small victory, a living thing she was helping to flourish. The bell above her door chimed, and she looked up to see Jack removing his hat as he entered. His hair was longer now, and he'd grown a beard over the winter months that made him look distinguished rather than rough. He'd been coming by every few days, sometimes with supplies for her garden, sometimes just to check on her progress, always with that same patient understanding that had first drawn her from her shell of grief. "Afternoon, Martha," he said, his voice carrying the warmth that had become familiar and comforting. "Thought you might like to know. That patch of wildflowers we planted on the hill is starting to come up real nice." Martha's heart lifted at the news. They had worked together throughout the fall and early winter, preparing Thomas's gravesite with a careful arrangement of native wildflowers and a small garden border. It had been Jack's idea to plant species that would naturalize and spread, creating a living memorial that would grow and change with the seasons. "Have you seen any of the Indian paintbrush yet?" she asked, setting down her tools and giving him her full attention. "Just the first shoots, but they're strong. Should have color by late May, early June." Jack moved closer to examine her seedlings, his calloused hands gentle as he touched the leaves of a young sunflower plant. "These are coming along well. You've got a real talent for this." The compliment brought a flush to Martha's cheeks. She had discovered, somewhat to her surprise, that she did indeed have a natural affinity for growing things. Perhaps it was because she understood what it meant to nurture something fragile, to provide the right conditions for growth, to be patient with the slow process of healing and development. "Jack," she said suddenly, the words coming before she could second-guess herself, "would you like to stay for supper tonight? I've got a pot roast in the oven, and it's far too much for just me." Jack's face lit up with genuine pleasure. "I'd like that very much, Martha. Thank you." As the afternoon wore on, they worked together in comfortable companionship, Martha tending to her plants, while Jack repaired a loose board on one of her display shelves. The easy domesticity of the scene would have seemed impossible to imagine 6 months earlier, but now it felt as natural as breathing. When evening approached, they walked together to Martha's small apartment above the flower shop. She had moved out of the boarding house after Mrs. Henderson had offered her the space in exchange for maintaining the building's front garden. It was a practical arrangement that had given Martha both independence and purpose. The apartment was modest but warm, decorated with dried flowers and a few pieces of furniture Jack had helped her select from the second-hand shop. On the mantelpiece sat a small framed photograph of Thomas, surrounded by wildflowers from his grave, not as a shrine to grief, but as a celebration of his brief but meaningful life. As Martha prepared their meal, Jack sat at the small kitchen table, watching her move with a grace she had slowly reclaimed. The woman who had been frozen by grief was gone, replaced by someone stronger, more resilient, yet still tender in the places where love and loss had carved their mark. "I had a letter from my sister in Colorado," Martha said, as she served the pot roast, breaking what had been a comfortable silence. "She wants me to come visit this summer." Jack felt a strange tightness in his chest at the thought of Martha leaving, even temporarily. Over the months, he had come to depend on her presence in ways he was only beginning to understand. "That sounds like it might be good for you," he said carefully. "Change of scenery, family." Martha studied his face, reading the conflict there with the intuition she had developed for understanding unspoken emotions. "I was thinking," she said slowly, "that maybe you might like to come with me, if you wanted to, that is. Sarah, my sister, she has a big ranch, and she's always looking for help with the horses." The suggestion hung in the air between them, loaded with implications neither had been quite ready to voice until now. Jack reached across the table and covered Martha's hand with his own, marveling at how such a simple touch could convey so much. "Martha," he said softly, "I need you to know something. These past months, getting to know you, watching you heal and grow strong again, it's meant everything to me. You've given me something I thought I'd lost forever." "What's that?" she whispered. "The belief that it's possible to love again without betraying the love you've already known." Martha's eyes filled with tears, but they were not the tears of grief she had shed so many months ago. These were tears of recognition, of gratitude, of hope for a future she was finally ready to imagine. "I feel the same way," she admitted. "For so long, I thought loving Thomas meant I had to stay locked in my grief, that moving forward would somehow diminish what he meant to me. But you've shown me that love doesn't diminish, it multiplies. It finds new places to grow." Jack lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "So what do you say we take that trip to Colorado together? Maybe we can figure out what comes next." Martha smiled, the expression lighting up her entire face. "I think Thomas would like that. He always loved adventures." Later that evening, as they sat on the small porch outside Martha's apartment, watching the stars emerge in the clear spring sky, Martha felt a profound sense of peace settle over her. The pain of losing Thomas would always be part of her, but it no longer defined her. She had learned to carry her love for him in a way that didn't preclude loving others, didn't prevent her from building a future that honored both her past and her possibilities. "Jack," she said, leaning against his shoulder as they shared the old quilt Elizabeth had made years ago, "do you think they would approve? Elizabeth and Thomas, I mean. Do you think they'd want us to be happy?" Jack was quiet for a long moment, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I think," he said finally, "that love wants love to continue. I think they'd want us to take care of each other, to build something beautiful together, to live fully in the time we have." Martha nodded, feeling the truth of his words settle into her bones. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, new growth. The flower shop would continue to flourish, the memorial garden on the hill would bloom with increasing abundance, and she and Jack would continue learning how to weave their separate stories into something new and beautiful. As the night deepened around them, Martha found herself thinking not of endings, but of beginnings. She thought of the seeds she had planted that afternoon, of the small green shoots already pushing through the soil in Thomas's garden, of the journey to Colorado that awaited them, and of all the tomorrows stretching ahead like an uncharted map full of possibility. The grieving woman who had sat silent and broken on the boarding house porch was still part of her, would always be part of her. But she was no longer the whole story. Martha Sullivan had learned to breathe again, had learned to hope again, had learned that healing didn't mean forgetting. It meant growing large enough to hold both sorrow and joy, both memory and possibility, both yesterday's love and tomorrow's promise. In the distance, a nightbird called, its song carried on the warm spring breeze. Martha closed her eyes and listened, feeling grateful for the sound, for the moment, for the steady presence of the man beside her. and for the long journey that had brought her from the darkness of that September grief to this place of quiet contentment and tentative hope. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, witnessing another small story of human resilience, another quiet triumph of love over loss, another testament to the extraordinary capacity of the human heart to heal, to grow, and to love again.